Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the morning edition. We have the latest from the New York Times. The Senate made a big decision overnight. We have that first. Then we cover the cases at the Supreme Court, the Jeffrey Epstein saga, and Trump's feelings about the Federal Reserve Chair. Plus, we have stories on death and K-beauty. Ladies and gentlemen, a Senate vote. Let's cover it. Early this morning, the Senate approved a White House request to cancel about $8 billion in funding for foreign aid and $1 billion for public broadcasting. Congress had previously authorized the spending. This matters to the aid programs and local news outlets that rely on that money. But it also matters because the Constitution gives Congress the power of the purse, the power to decide what the government spends. By bowing to Trump's request, Republicans made the rare choice to cut that power. To cede that power. The state Senate, the Senate voted 51 to 48. Two Republican senators objected. Susan Collins of Maine and Lisa Murkowski of Alaska. The House is expected to give final approval to the package later this week and send it to Trump to sign. Ladies and gentlemen, I will have a link in the video description if you want to read the bill. Ladies and gentlemen, the Supreme Court docket. Let's cover it. Why has the Supreme Court sided with the Trump regime so often? In many cases, it won't say. A colleague by the name of Adam Liptak has a new story about a curious type of Supreme Court case. These aren't the lawsuits about big constitutional questions. These wend their way upward slowly through district and circuit courts. They yield rulings, reversals, and reams of briefings along the way At the end, justices interrogate lawyers during oral arguments and then exchange drafts of their views. The result, Adam writes, is often a comprehensive set of opinions that can be as long as a short novel. The cases Adam writes about now are something else. Emergency applications. These require a snap decision about whether a policy whether a policy can go into effect. My editorial edition, ladies and gentlemen. In other words, ahead, or must wait while lower judges argue over its legality. Critics call this the shadow docket, and the court usually rules on the urgent cases within weeks. Trump has now almost all 18 of these petitions. And unlike normal rulings, justices often don't explain their rationale. Some recent examples, for example, 1, the court on Monday said Trump could dismantle the education department, which is not allowed by the Constitution. The unsigned order was a single paragraph about procedural mechanics. Adam called it an exercise of power, not reason. For example, 2, the court in June let the regime deport migrants to countries other than the ones that they are from, since the justices offered no rationale. The government had to ask for clarification about whether the rulings applied to men it had already sent to a U.S. base in Djibouti, DJIBOUTI. The answer was yes. In May, the court allowed Trump to enforce a ban on transgender troops serving in the military. Granted, ladies and gentlemen, this was only temporary. This was only a temporary, in other words, meaning for now, ruling that's bogus and ridiculous and discriminative. In the ruling, its ruling was brief. and it was unsigned. Ladies and gentlemen, fast thinking, fast work. None of these emergency decisions are final. In each, lawyers can fight the policy in lower courts. Perhaps the decision will eventually of the Supreme Court decide that the government can't deport migrants from around the world to Sudan or unmake a federal agency without say-so of Congress. But by then, critics of the shadow docket say the work will have been done already. The justices themselves have justified over the propriety of emergency rulings. In a 2021 dissent, Elena Kagan wrote a midnight ruling that effectively overturned Roe v. Wade in Texas. A month later, Samuel Alito returned fire in a speech. The catchy and sinister term shadow docket has been used, ladies and gentlemen, to portray the court as having been captured by a dangerous cabal that resorts to sneaky and improper methods to get its ways. You can't expect the EMTs and the emergency rooms to do the same thing that a team of physicians and nurses will do when they are handling a matter when time is not of the essence in that same way. Some law professors have built a new database tracking the rise of the emergency docket. The first halt of 2025 represented a record high with 15 emergency applications accepted as of June 18. The next highest peak was 11 from the final year of the previous Trump regime. Ladies and gentlemen, the latest news on the Epstein files. On social media, Trump berated supporters who are upset with the regime's handling of the Jeffrey Epstein investigation. He blamed Democrats. Ladies and gentlemen, this is completely false. Everything that happened with Jeffrey Epstein happened under the previous Trump regime. No Democratic president did anything with the Jeffrey Epstein files. Jeffrey Epstein died. If he was murdered, he died. If he committed suicide, he died. He died under the previous Trump regime. Trump was in office previously in 2019. No Democratic president was in office at that time. Before that, Barack Obama was in office, but no. It was all Trump. Ladies and gentlemen, the regime fired a Manhattan prosecutor who worked on cases against Epstein and an associate. Late night hosts again covered Epstein and MAGA. Ladies and gentlemen, immigration, let's cover it. At Florida's new immigration detention center named Alligator Alcatraz, detainees say they live in tents, shower infrequently, and lack medication. Morale is a low among the California National Guard troops who Trump illegally, unconstitutionally, and unlawfully deployed to Los Angeles, and some are questioning the mission. Many ICE raids take place in public spaces, parking lots, job sites, neighborhood streets. In the video, which, ladies and gentlemen, I will have a link to in the video description, Jennifer Medina, who's a political reporter, speaks with a woman who recorded an arrest near her home. Ladies and gentlemen, more on politics. Let's cover it. Trump frequently asked, labeled his opponents evil. No, Trump, I think you're the evil one. Or I don't think, I know you're the evil one. That allows him to justify all kinds of actions usually considered extreme, writes Peter Baker. Republicans in Congress said this would be crypto week, but their efforts to pass several cryptocurrency bills in the House stalled after ultra-conservative members revolted. Ladies and gentlemen, the Middle East. Let's cover it. A stampede outside an aid distribution center in southern Gaza, killed at least 20 people. The latest in a string of deaths near aid and sites in the enclave. Israel attacked Syria's capital. It said the airstrikes aimed to help drive government forces from a from a region dominated by the Druze minority, which Israel has pledged to protect. Mike Huckabee, the U.S. ambassador to Israel, made a highly unusual announcement at Benjamin Netanyahu's corruption trial. Dozens of people, including children, died in a shopping mall fire in eastern Iraq, officials said. Ladies and gentlemen, more on international news. Let's cover it. Eswatini said it would send 5 migrants deported there by the U.S. in their countries of origin. To their countries of origin. The U.S. had said those countries wouldn't accept them. Germany, Australia, and Poland have set up vehicle search checkpoints to crack down on immigration. They're also snarling traffic. Japan's agriculture minister has released stockpiled rice in an effort to lower prices and mollify voters. One of China's most popular video games is called Revenge of the on Gold Diggers. It's prompted debate about misogyny, gender dynamics, and economic pressures. Li Yan writes, Liyan. Ladies and gentlemen, other big stories. Let's cover it. A wildfire has devastated the north rim of the Grand Canyon. A former New York City police commissioner sued Mayor Eric Adams, accusing him of running City Hall and the police department as a criminal enterprise. A lightning strike at an outdoor archery range in Jackson Township, New Jersey, killed a man and left 13 other people with burns, including a 7-year-old. Ladies and gentlemen, trending. After a 7.3 magnitude earthquake, people were searching online about the risk of a tsunami in Alaska. Officials issued a warning for parts of the coast, then downgraded it to an advisory. Trump said on social media that that Coca-Cola had agreed to use cane sugar to sweeten U.S. Coke rather than high fructose corn syrup. It's just better, he declared. Ladies and gentlemen, can Trump do that? Trump has a draft of a letter firing Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell. He has considered sending it, and he waived a copy of it in the Oval Office in front of House Republicans. But Powell's term doesn't end until 2026, and he says he'll stay until then. A president can fire the head of the central bank agency only for cause, like fraud. According to a recent Supreme Court ruling, ladies and gentlemen. Now Trump's allies are talking about accusations of misconduct. Colby and Tony Romm, R-O-M-M, explain. Ladies and gentlemen, Trump wants Powell gone. Let's cover it. The wannabe dictator believes the economy would soar, and his political standing alongside it, if only the Federal the Federal Reserve Chair would lower the cost of borrowing. But Powell has held interest rates in place to forestall inflation, which may creep up on Trump's tariffs. Creep up as Trump's tariffs take hold. The president and wannabe dictator says this makes Powell a very stupid person. The claims, ladies and gentlemen, that the Republicans say that Powell has mismanaged a revamp of Federal Reserve that cost billions. The project is running around $700 million over budget. Ladies and gentlemen, what's next? Legal and economic experts say that this is little more than a pretext to axe Powell, and that it's unlikely prosecutors could ever prove a case against him. If the regime cites misconduct or fraud in firing him, Powell will get to defend himself in court, and a judge may stop the dismissal if it looks like Powell might fight the charges and win. The Daily, ladies and gentlemen, today is on their flight. The show calls it the most toxic relationship in Washington. Ladies and gentlemen, more on the economy. Months after Trump announced sweeping tariffs, inflation remains muted. The job market is strong. Will it last? And ladies and gentlemen, before we continue, no, the job market is not strong right now. That is a flat out lie. I will autocorrect the morning report right now. The U.S. reached a trade agreement with Indonesia. It exempts U.S. goods from tariffs while levying a 19% duty on Indonesian goods. Ladies and gentlemen, I will fact check that again. That is not true. Unfortunately, I wish it was, but it's not. No goods are exempt from these illegal, unconstitutional, unlawful tariffs that were not approved by Congress of the orange tampons. Ladies and gentlemen, opinions. Students thrive in liberal art programs. Universities should fund them. Accordingly, Jennifer Ray writes. Here's a column by Lydia Polgreen on Trump's antagonistic diplomacy. Ladies and gentlemen, there will be a link in the video description below. Everything the Times offers, all-in-one subscription. Morning readers save an unlimited access to the Times with this introductory offer. Ladies and gentlemen, morning reads. Let's talk about death. From end-of-life care to burials and beyond, we answer your questions on morality. K-Beauty. Fearing imminent tariffs, Americans buying Korean beauty products in bulk. Heat pumps. Should you get one? Take our quiz. That's 2 questions. Ladies and gentlemen, a link will be down in the video description. Ladies and gentlemen, your pick. Yesterday's most clicked link in the morning was a video about Trump's pivot to supporting Ukraine. Ladies and gentlemen, time for sports. NCAA. Fox Sports is close to completing a deal with Barstool Sports. The agreement would place Barstool's CEO Dave Portnoy on Fox's big big noon kickoff on Saturdays, and Barstool's content could fill a weekday morning cable TV gap. Ladies and gentlemen, lives lived. Audun Greenvold, who won bronze for Norway Inski Cross at the 2010 Winter Olympics died after being struck by lightning during a cabin trip. He was 49. Ladies and gentlemen, arts and ideas. Let's cover it. It is boom time for America's cheesemakers, but not because the cheese whey, WHEY, a byproduct of cheese making that was once considered waste, is now in demand from weightlifters and health conscious people seeking to get more protein into their bodies. Read more about how our protein obsession in transforming the dairy industry.